Hey guys, we're here at Chino Valley Muffin Performance getting ready to install a 1.5-inch suspension system by REIKA. It's going to go on your first generation Crosstrek. Let's get it in the shop and get it going. All right guys, just wanted to go over the kit real quick with you. We've got our two upper strut spacers. They are marked passenger and driver with a P and a D. We've got our rear strut spacers. We've got our brake line relocation brackets, which most other kits don't come with. Then we have our subframe drop and our new bolts that we'll be using in our subframe drop. All right guys, so we're gonna start with getting the car secured on some jack stands and taking the wheel off. All right guys, now we got the tire off. We're gonna start with the first step, which is gonna be disconnecting the front sway bar. You're gonna wanna do this to both sides in parallel basically, so it's easier when you go put it all back together. It's gonna be a 17mm nut on the bottom sway bar mount. All right, so on these sway bar end links, sometimes you will run into where the stud itself will start spinning, so use an Allen on the inside and a 17mm. All right, now that we've got the sway bar disconnected, we're gonna move on to the brake line and all right, now that we've got our brake line removed and out of the way and our ABS cable pushed out of the way, we're gonna work on the two upper strut bolts. They're gonna be a 19mm. Before you go to loosen these, you're gonna wanna mark the misalignment bolt for future reference. It's not gonna get it perfectly back aligned. You will need an alignment after the fact, but it'll help out. And once you pull the lower bolt, the spindle's gonna wanna drop. So try to hold it best as possible so you don't rip the axle out of it. When removing the lower bolt, it does get stuck in here, so you're gonna wanna put the nut back on and give it a few taps with the hammer. So you don't ruin the threads. And it's gonna drop out of place. Just don't let it fall too hard or it will end up pulling this axle out of the CV joint. All right guys, now that we've got the lower all disconnected, we're working on the top side. We're gonna be using a 12mm socket. You're gonna wanna unscrew these. Once we undo the last one, the strut's gonna literally drop out, so you're gonna wanna hold it or have a friend help you. All right guys, now that we have the strut out of the car, we're gonna be installing our new spacer. We're gonna be using our factory hardware to install the spacer onto the strut. Once we get our strut spacer mounted to the strut, we're gonna end up going back to the car and drilling out with a 27/64 drill bit to allow the new larger studs to fit. And once you get these snug, you're gonna wanna torque them to the torque spec recommended in the instructions. All right guys, now that we're back at the car, we're gonna be drilling with a 27/64 drill bit through the three main strut top holes. All right, now we've got our 3 holes drilled. We're gonna go over with some touch-up paint just to cover up any of the bare metal to protect for corrosion. All right guys, now the strut's ready to go back in the car. All right, once we've got the strut up into the pocket here, we're gonna go ahead and tighten down these 3 bolts. We're gonna wait to torque them until we get all the bolts attached from the bottom. All right guys, now we got the strut back in the vehicle, snugged up on top here. We're gonna start working on the bottom portion back again, starting with our lower factory bolt to get the strut mounted to the spindle. Then the upper one, which is going to be the cam bolt. And before tightening the lower one, we're going to realign the top one to the marks we made previously. All right, we're gonna go ahead and retorque these to factory spec and move on to our brake line and ABS. ABS is just gonna go right back where it was there. And then move on to our brake line. Back in the same location with the factory hardware. We're gonna go ahead and reattach the lower sway bar now. We're gonna go ahead and tighten down these 3 bolts. All right guys, now we're onto the rear of the vehicle and we're gonna start removing everything from the rear of the trunk. On this part of it, we're gonna have to remove the clips that are holding the foam pieces in. And that'll give us access to the 2 top strut bolts. All right, once we've got all the interior taken out of the vehicle, we're gonna start by removing these 14mm nuts. All right guys, now that we've got the rear of the trunk cleaned out, the strut unbolted from the top, we're down back here at the bottom, got it up on a jack stand, secured, tires off. We're gonna start with loosening up the upper control arm bolts. They're gonna be a 17mm. And you're just gonna loosen these up. You're not gonna take them apart. You're also gonna end up loosening up the front lower control arm bolt as well. All right guys, now that we've got the upper control arm bolts loose, the front control arm bolt loose, not taken out, we're gonna take out this lower control arm bolt and drop this lower control arm forward. All right, now that we've got the upper control arm loose, we're gonna go ahead and loosen up the lower control arm to the subframe bolt. We're not gonna take it off, we're just gonna loosen it up. All right guys, now that we've got the upper control arm and lower control arm bolts loose, we're gonna go ahead and start with removing the lower sway bar link. And then we're gonna move to the knuckle and remove this bolt, which will allow the lower control arm to fall down and will remove the lower strut mount. And the strut will come right out. All right guys, now that we got the strut out of the vehicle, we're gonna use our rear strut spacer and install it onto the strut. We're gonna use the original hardware from the strut. And you gotta start putting the nuts on simultaneously. All right guys, now that we got the strut back to the vehicle, we're gonna go ahead and put it in. You are gonna need a second set of hands to tighten the bolts up top once we get the strut in. All right, now that we've got the strut back in the vehicle, we're gonna leave the lower control arm assemblies off the vehicle, and we're gonna move on to the spacers that go in the rear subframe here. We're gonna start with these three up here. The first one's gonna be a 12mm, which is gonna loosen this panel. Then we're going to move on to the actual subframe body mounts here. There's going to be one in the front and also one in the rear. Those are going to be a 19mm that we're just going to lower down and loosen with the jack. So then we're going to head underneath the vehicle and lower the subframe down until we can fit these spacers in between the two and the front spacer underneath this one here. All right, now that we've dropped the cradle enough to fit the spacers in, we're going to go ahead and put the spacers in the spots they need to go to. The front one's going to go up to the front two bolts here. And the rear one. All right, now that we've got the subframe pushed up back towards the body of the vehicle, we're gonna end up finger tightening these, get a couple threads in. And now that those are aligned, we're gonna go to the front with the two new bolts supplied in the hardware kit. All right guys, now that we've got our spacers all in, we're gonna go ahead and put the lower control arms back together and torque everything down to factory specs. All right, now that we've got the rear suspension put back together, we also include in our kit is a brake line relocation tab. That's gonna give a lot less stress on the rear brake line for you. All right, now that we got everything bolted back up, we can go ahead and tighten them down and torque them to spec. All right guys, now that we've got the vehicle back on the ground, we can go ahead and torque our top two bolts to factory specs. So this kit will allow you to run a 215/75 R15 tire with a 15x7 plus 15 offset wheel with still plenty of clearance without trimming any bumpers or anything like that. Like you saw, it was pretty easy to do. Some typical hand tools, maybe a buddy to help you out, and we're all set to go. Off to alignment.